There's a moment that almost nobody notices. It happens quietly, no screaming, no dramatic goodbye, no shattered glass on the floor. Just a woman standing in the kitchen at 2:13 in the morning, staring at a dim light over the sink while the rest of the world sleeps. Her tea is gone cold, her phone is face down beside her, and somewhere deep inside her chest, something finally stops reaching. You wouldn't see it if you walked past her. She still answers messages, still smiles in photographs, still asks if you ate today, still remembers the little things about everyone else. But an empath woman has a threshold, and when she crosses it, she does not become louder. She becomes quieter. That's the part people misunderstand. Because most people think an empath breaks from cruelty. They think betrayal is what destroys her. They think distance, lies, or neglect are the deepest wounds. But they're wrong. The thing that hurts an empath woman the most is realizing she gave her soul to someone who only valued the comfort she provided, not the person she truly was. And the terrifying part is, she usually realizes it long after the damage is done. Because empath women do not love in ordinary ways. They study your silences. They memorize your emotional weather. They notice the shift in your breathing before you even admit something is wrong. They sit beside versions of you that nobody else has the patience to understand. And when they love you, they do it with the kind of devotion that slowly empties them. Not all at once, little by little, until one day they look in the mirror and cannot remember the last time someone held them with the same emotional care they've been giving away for years. And that's where this story really begins. An empath woman can survive pain. What she cannot survive forever is feeling emotionally unseen by someone she chose to see completely. That is the wound. Not abandonment, not rejection, but invisibility. You have to understand something most people never will about women like this. Empaths don't fall in love with perfection. They fall in love with potential, with hidden sadness, with broken language, with the tiny tremble in someone's voice that says, "I've been carrying this alone." And because of that, they often become sanctuaries for emotionally unavailable people. She becomes the safe place, the emotional translator, the calm during your chaos. She listens when nobody else listens. She forgives things she should not forgive. She waits through moods, confusion, distance, and emotional inconsistency because she believes there is something wounded underneath your behavior worth loving. But slowly, without realizing it, the relationship becomes built around your emotions, while hers disappear into the background like fading wallpaper. And at first, she won't complain. That's important, because empath women are dangerously skilled at self-abandonment. They know how to make excuses for people they love. He's just stressed. She's overwhelmed. They didn't mean it. They had a hard childhood. They're trying in their own way. An empath woman can intellectualize almost any pain if it helps her preserve emotional connection. That's why people often mistake her endurance for invincibility. But every time her feelings are dismissed, every time her vulnerability is met with indifference, every time she expresses hurt and gets called too sensitive, a fracture forms quietly inside her. And the terrifying thing is, she rarely breaks at the moment of impact. She breaks later, in silence, while folding laundry, while driving home alone, while staring at old messages trying to figure out why she suddenly feels so empty beside someone she once would have died for. Because eventually, a horrifying realization enters her mind. Not, "They didn't love me." No, something much worse. "They loved what I gave them, but never learned who I was." That realization changes her permanently. Because empath women don't need constant attention. They don't need grand gestures. They don't even need perfection. They just need emotional reciprocity, to feel considered, felt, protected emotionally in the same way they protect others. And when that never comes, something ancient inside them begins shutting down. You'll notice it in strange ways. She stops explaining herself, stops asking for reassurance, stops telling you what hurt her, not because she healed, but because she no longer believes being understood is safe. And this is where most relationships quietly die long before they officially end. Because once an empath woman feels emotionally invisible for too long, she starts grieving the relationship while still inside it. That's the part nobody sees. The morning begins early. While she's still saying, I love you, while she's still showing up, while she's still trying, a part of her is already sitting alone somewhere deep inside herself, whispering, if I disappeared emotionally, would they even notice? And when an empath woman begins asking herself that question, the distance that forms afterward is almost impossible to reverse. Because in the next stage, she stops fighting for the connection entirely. Not out of hate, but exhaustion. Exhaustion in an empath woman does not look the way people expect. It doesn't always look like tears. It doesn't always sound angry. Sometimes it looks frighteningly calm, like someone who has finally stopped arguing with reality. That's the moment most people miss. Because when an empath woman still fights with you, cries in front of you, tries to explain herself for the 100th time, there is still hope. There is still emotional investment. Her heart is still reaching across the distance trying to find yours. But when she becomes emotionally quiet, when her voice softens instead of rises, when she says, it's okay, too quickly, that's when something irreversible may already be happening beneath the surface. You see, empath women are not afraid of pain. They are afraid of becoming emotionally homeless inside relationships. There is a difference. Pain can be survived. Conflict can be repaired. Even betrayal can sometimes heal. But feeling alone beside someone you once trusted with your inner world? That changes the nervous system. Because an empath woman does not simply hear your words. She absorbs emotional atmosphere. She notices when affection becomes mechanical, when your attention becomes fragmented, when your eyes stop looking at her with curiosity and begin looking through her like she's become emotionally familiar furniture in your life. And she will not always confront you immediately. Instead, she studies the patterns silently. That's what makes empath women dangerous to underestimate. They are observers before they are reactors. They notice the delay in your responses, the emotional absence hidden beneath polite behavior, the way you suddenly stop asking deeper questions about her inner world. And while you think everything is fine because there's no dramatic confrontation, she is slowly collecting evidence that her heart is no longer being held carefully. This is where the deepest hurt begins. Not because you stopped loving her completely, but because you stopped seeing her consciously. There's a subtle cruelty in that. A person can survive being hated more easily than being emotionally overlooked. At least hatred still acknowledges existence. But emotional neglect? That creates a different kind of loneliness. Especially for an empath woman who spent years making sure your emotional needs were never ignored. And eventually she begins doing something heartbreaking. She starts shrinking herself. Not physically, spiritually. She talks less about what excites her, stops sharing the thoughts that kept her awake at night, stops revealing the strange, beautiful, vulnerable parts of herself because experience has taught her they will not be received with care. So she becomes easier, simpler, less emotional, less expressive, less needy. But that version of her is not her true self. That is her survival self. And almost nobody notices the transformation while it's happening. Because externally, she still functions. She still laughs sometimes, still responds, still participates in the relationship. But internally, she has begun rationing her emotional energy the way people ration water during a drought, only giving what feels safe, only revealing what cannot be rejected. And the tragedy is, many people suddenly become attentive again only after she emotionally detaches. That's when panic appears, when her warmth disappears, when her nurturing becomes neutral. When the woman who once chased emotional closeness suddenly seems distant, composed, almost unreachable. People mistake this phase for cruelty. It isn't cruelty, it's grief after exhaustion. An empath woman can only beg for emotional depth for so long before dignity takes over. And once dignity replaces longing, she becomes terrifyingly hard to reach again. Because now she's no longer trying to convince you to value her. She's trying to understand why she ever begged for basic emotional presence in the first place. That question haunts her. Not because she thinks she was weak, but because empath women love with sincerity so pure that they often assume others are loving them with the same depth. And realizing that isn't true, realizing someone benefited from her tenderness without truly protecting it, can make her feel profoundly betrayed by her own instincts. That is why, after enough emotional neglect, an empath woman changes in ways people rarely understand. She becomes more guarded with her softness, more selective with vulnerability, more suspicious of one-sided emotional dynamics disguised as love. And underneath all of it, there is one devastating thought she may never say out loud. I would have carried your pain forever if you had simply remembered to care about mine too. And once that sentence begins living inside her heart, the way she loves you starts changing forever. The most dangerous moment in an empath woman is not when she's angry. It's when she finally accepts the truth. Because acceptance in people like her does not arrive suddenly. It arrives like winter, quietly, one cold morning at a time. At first, she still tries to save the connection, still tries to explain the emotional distance between you, still searches for the missing piece that might bring warmth back into the relationship. But eventually, she gets tired of translating her pain into languages nobody around her seems willing to learn. And something shifts, not dramatically, internally, like a door softly closing somewhere deep inside her mind. This is the moment most people misread completely. They think she's doing better, think she's finally less emotional, less intense, less affected. But what's really happening is far more heartbreaking. She's detaching from the fantasy that you will suddenly become emotionally aware enough to love her the way she needed. That fantasy kept her alive for a long time. The hope that one day you would notice. One day you would ask deeper questions. One day you would look at her and finally understand how much emotional weight she carried alone while pretending she was okay. But hope becomes dangerous when it keeps a person emotionally starving. And empath women eventually realize this. That realization changes the energy of everything, because once an empath woman stops hoping, she stops bleeding emotionally in front of you. That's why the end often feels confusing to the other person. There's no explosion, no revenge, no dramatic declaration, just distance, stillness, a strange emotional calm that feels almost unnatural compared to how deeply she once loved. And that calm terrifies people, because suddenly the woman who once over-explained her feelings now answers with one sentence. The woman who once fought for connection now lets conversations die. The woman who once reached for your hand now folds her emotions inward where you cannot touch them anymore. This is not manipulation. It's emotional self-preservation after prolonged disappointment. You have to understand, an empath woman does not stop loving overnight. She stops expecting. And those are two very different things. A part of her may still care deeply about you while simultaneously realizing she cannot survive much longer inside a relationship where her emotional reality is constantly minimized. That internal conflict destroys her quietly. Because empath women do not enjoy detachment. Detachment feels unnatural to them. Their instinct is to connect, to nurture, to repair emotional fractures before they widen into permanent distance. So when an empath woman finally withdraws emotionally, it usually means she exhausted every internal argument for staying emotionally open. And nobody talks about how painful that process is for her. People only see the silence afterward. They don't see the nights she spent questioning herself, wondering if she asked for too much, wondering if she was too emotional, too sensitive, too complicated to love correctly. That's the cruelest part of emotional neglect. It slowly teaches deeply loving people to distrust their own needs, until one day they apologize for wanting basic tenderness. And when an empath woman realizes she has been shrinking her emotional needs just to maintain connection, something inside her begins waking up. Not anger, self-respect. Quiet, aching self-respect. The kind that whispers, "You cannot keep abandoning yourself to avoid being abandoned by others." That sentence changes everything. Because now she starts seeing the relationship differently. She notices how often she carried emotional conversations alone, how frequently she comforted you while hiding her own exhaustion, how many times she accepted crumbs and called them love because she was afraid of losing the connection completely. And suddenly, the loneliness she feared outside the relationship feels less frightening than the loneliness she experienced within it. That realization is the beginning of her emotional departure. Even if she hasn't physically left yet. You can feel it when it happens. Her energy changes. Her eyes stop searching yours for reassurance. Her affection becomes gentler but more distant, like someone slowly saying goodbye internally before speaking it aloud. And the terrifying thing is, by the time most people notice her pulling away emotionally, she has already spent months grieving them in silence. Months. That's why empath women rarely come back the same after feeling deeply undervalued. Because once they finally see how much of themselves they sacrificed trying to keep love alive, they cannot unsee it. And in the final stage, she begins choosing herself in ways that will completely shock the people who thought she would stay forever. When an empath woman finally chooses herself, it rarely looks triumphant in the beginning. It looks heartbreaking. Because walking away emotionally from someone she deeply loved feels, to her, like tearing out a living piece of her own identity. People misunderstand that. They think empath women leave because they stopped caring. No. Most of the time, they leave because they cared beyond what was healthy for them. And there comes a moment when even the softest soul realizes love cannot survive where emotional safety does not exist. That realization breaks something open inside her. For years, she may have believed her purpose was to heal everyone around her, to understand, to endure, to remain patient through emotional inconsistency because she saw the wounded child inside other people. But eventually she asks herself a question that changes her life forever. Who has been protecting me while I've been protecting everyone else? That question echoes through her like thunder. Because suddenly she sees it all clearly. The nights she swallowed her own pain to avoid burdening others. The conversations where she listened for hours while nobody noticed she was silently drowning too. The times she begged gently for emotional reciprocity and received temporary affection instead of lasting understanding. And she realizes something devastating. Being needed is not the same as being valued. That distinction changes everything. Because many people adored what she provided emotionally. Her patience, her warmth, her loyalty, her ability to make broken people feel less alone. But very few ever stopped long enough to ask what it cost her to be that person every single day. Empath women often become emotional homes for others while having nowhere safe to rest themselves. And eventually the exhaustion becomes spiritual. Not physical, spiritual. The kind of tiredness sleep cannot fix. The kind that settles behind the eyes and makes a person question why love has always felt like sacrifice instead of shelter. And this is where her transformation begins. Quietly. She starts reclaiming pieces of herself she abandoned to maintain connection. Her voice, her boundaries, her intuition, her right to feel deeply without apologizing for it. At first, people around her may call her distant, cold, different. But what they're really witnessing is an empath woman learning that self-respect sometimes requires disappointing the people who benefited from her lack of boundaries. That is not cruelty. That is awakening. And awakenings are painful. Because now she notices things she once ignored. She notices who only contacts her when emotionally convenient, who listened to her words but never heard her heart, who accepted endless compassion from her while offering almost none in return. And instead of fighting desperately to keep those connections alive, she begins letting them fade naturally. That's what shocks people most, the absence of chaos. Because when an empath woman is truly done, she does not always seek revenge. She does not always try to hurt you back. Sometimes she simply becomes unavailable to the dynamic that once consumed her. Emotionally unreachable in the places where she once overextended herself trying to be loved properly. And there is something profoundly haunting about that kind of departure. Because people often realize her value fully only after her emotional presence disappears. Only after the long paragraphs stop. After the late-night reassurance vanishes. After the warmth they took for granted is no longer waiting for them at the end of difficult days. That's when the silence becomes loud. And meanwhile, the empath woman who once questioned her worth begins slowly rediscovering herself beneath the ruins of overgiving. She starts noticing how peaceful life feels when she no longer has to beg for emotional consistency. How light her nervous system becomes around people who communicate clearly. How beautiful love feels when she is not carrying it entirely alone. And perhaps for the first time in years, she understands this truth. Real love does not require her to disappear in order to keep someone else comfortable. That realization heals her and breaks her at the same time. because she mourns all the versions of herself that tolerated emotional starvation just to avoid losing connection. But she also begins becoming someone new, someone softer with herself, someone wiser, someone who finally understands that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And the next time she loves, it will be different. Not less deep, not less sincere, but more awake. Because now she knows the most painful lesson of all. An empath woman can survive almost anything, except continuously giving her soul to someone who only notices her once she's gone.